Hello, everyone. Okay, today we're going to talk about designing valid research. Creating valid research is important for a few different reasons. The first is that you need to conduct valid research so that you can tell your audience who's ever reading your research that the conclusions you reach are actually accurate conclusions that reflect your population. All right. The second reason you need valid research is because research should have some sort of predictive quality for you being able to predict the behavior or the results of things that are going to happen in the future. The best way to think about this is presidential election polling. This is research. So in the summer months, July, August, into September, there are pollsters that are conducting research to go around to the population and say, who are you going to vote for president? And their effort is to try to predict who is actually going to win the presidency come November. All right. And the only way you can do that is if you have good, solid methods. If you have bad methods for collecting data with regard to who will win the president, you are going to have a bad prediction, a prediction that is incorrect with regard to winning the presidency. All right. Within this PowerPoint presentation near the end, we're also going to go over sampling, how to make sure that you have an accurate sample that does reflect the population. This is where a lot of people's methods go off the rails. Is they just sort of say, well, a sample is I just have to go find 500 people to take my survey, and that's a good enough sample, right? No, there are actually ways in which you need to choose those 500 people in order for those 500 people to actually be reflective of the population that you're studying. So we'll go over random sampling, simple random samples, systemic ordinal samples. We'll go over all that near the end. This is a lot of jargon information that you just need to know what it means. So I'll do my best to make it exciting, but make sure you're taking notes because this stuff is extremely important for you so that when you design your research, you're doing it in a way that is reflecting the population you're studying. And so when you look at other people's research, you can tell whether or not that research is good or bad based on the methods used in order to collect that data. So there are two types of ways in which you can ask yourself, what is it that I should study first and foremost? The first is what's known as derivative. The second is original. Derivative just means it derives from somebody else's study, right? You are learning, or excuse me, you are leaning on the results of other individuals. So someone else has done a study and you want to dig a little bit deeper into the same type of study, all right? Now, there are pros and cons to this, right? The obvious pro is that results need to be replicated. So if I do a study that is talking about smoking habits of college students and I come to the conclusion that they are in decline, you might want to do a similar type of study to see if the results that I got are actually accurate. There is what's known as a replication crisis in the social sciences, where there are a lot of sort of famous social science research papers that are showing to be untrue with regard to the results. They cannot be replicated, and people are trying to figure out, what went wrong with the methods. The conclusions are inaccurate because the methods that were put in place were not firm enough in order to sort of shore up solid results, and we'll show you how to do that here in a couple slides as well. All right. The obvious cons of derivative research is that it can be boring when you kind of keep reading the same stuff over and over again. Yeah, it can be boring to sort of try to do somebody else's study. If you just kind of keep doing the same thing all the time, you're just kind of rereading the same literature and get a little boring for the researcher, right? The other con of derivative research that you need to be aware of is that it can set up what's known as confirmation bias. So if there's a social scientist that comes to a conclusion that I really, really like, I might, confirmation bias, I might go out there and try to replicate the results in order to kind of get the same results. So I'm going to start cherry picking data. So if I like the conclusion, I'm going to set up my study that furthers this theory or this worldview, right? And if the original research is flawed, I'm not really helping to kind of correct it. So if a researcher comes to a conclusion, especially on a controversial issue, let's say it's a public policy issue with regard to welfare reform or affirmative action policies, abortion, right? If somebody comes to a conclusion that I like that political policy, I'm going to try to replicate results that find similar conclusions in order to sort of propagate, the policy that I want. And it could be unknowingly, right? This doesn't always happen maliciously. But if there's a policy I want, I just kind of see data everywhere that supports my worldview already. So anytime you're doing derivative research, you have to be careful. It's like if I already like the conclusion this author found, I need to be extra careful to check my biases, engage in the research dispassionately, so that I'm not just reproducing research in order to find conclusions that I like. All right. So you want to just be very, very careful and understand that, even if you like the conclusion, that conclusion could be wrong. All right. So you want to make sure that you're checking the methods as opposed to just engaging in confirmation bias. Now, with regard to original research, this means that you're asking a totally new question. All right. So you have a new question about, the world is constantly changing. There's new forms of communication that pop up. So for instance, the iPhone is relatively new, just in the last 10, 15 years. So there's ways in which people are communicating that are different now, right? Dating's differently, face-to-face communication versus texting versus phone calls, or there's a whole new host of ways in which we could research how are people communicating. All this stuff going on Zoom, right? There's this whole new research field with regard to like Zoom classrooms and how awful they are compared to in person, right? Everyone thought technology is going to change the way we do college education. I think a lot of people are just itching to get back in the classroom and never want to do another Zoom meeting the rest of their life. All right, I might be one of those people. All right, so original research, your new questions should be driven from existing literature. So what you do is you go through all of the research. We've talked about this with literature reviews. You go through all the research that currently exists on your topic. So let's say it's parent-child communication, and then you say, okay, but nobody's done any research with regard to parent-child communication via text message, right? Nobody's doing a lot of research with regard to parent-child communication through new social media apps. So you want to fill that new gap within the sort of existing topic, within the within the discipline or the topic that you're interested in. All right, so that's what original research is. You are filling a gap that's not there. Derivative research is somebody's already done this study and found results, and I'm just going to try to replicate them to make sure that their original study was accurate and it accurately reflects the population. Validity. This is a huge term in methods. All right, so validity is about the accuracy of the study. Does the study accurately reflect the population that you're studying? Okay, so there's two ways that you want to check validity: internal validity and external validity. Internal validity means that the study accurately measures the habits of the participants within the study. All right. External validity is whether or not the study can be generalized to people outside of the study. So if you're studying college students and smoking habits, does your study accurately measure the habits of the people in the study, right? And then that's the internal. The external is whether or not those results can be applied to all college students. Can you accurately predict how many college students smoke in general, even with regard to the people who weren't in your study? All right. Some other things, texting, political affiliation, etc. This becomes a little bit dicey when people do studies on college campuses. We've talked about this before. If I'm a researcher, especially if I'm a professor on a college campus, the people that are around me are mostly 18 to 22-year-olds. So if I constantly go to them as research participants, I might have some internal validity with regard to being able to predict the habits of people on college classrooms, but I can't predict the habits of every single, American citizen across the country, right? And this is where a lot of people who are researchers try to exaggerate the results a little bit too much. They might say, I did this big study and it seems as if the country is getting, more left-wing or more Democrat. And it's like, okay, you just said the country is getting more left-wing or more Democrat. But with regard to this internal-external validity situation, the participants in your study were a bunch of 18 to 24-year-old college students. Of course, 18 to 24-year-old college students skew left. And what research has shown us over the last several decades is as people get older, they get more conservative, right? And so you want to make sure that you're saying, okay, I don't really know if the country's going more left or if it's just the fact that I interviewed a bunch of 18 to 24-year-old college students. I could say, it seems pretty reasonable that college students still skew left with regard to their political affiliation, but that doesn't say anything about the country at large, right? So my study might not have any external validity with regard to predicting political affiliation outside of the college students who participated in my study. All right. So where's the validity in your study? Does it have good, solid internal validity? And can it predict and generalize the habits of people outside the study? All right, some more ways that you want to test validity. One is called measurement validity. Did I measure what I actually said I was trying to measure? So we can go back to this idea of, love and happiness and how we need to operationalize these abstract terms. So there's this famous happiness study that comes out once a year. It's a world happiness study, and they try to, rank the happiest countries in the world. And there's always people who are arguing whether or not their measurements are valid, right? The U.S. never really ranks all that high, and people are like, are the measurements good? Because you can't really put a number on how happy people are, right? So what you do is you try to take these measurable things and try to associate them with happiness. So, how much leisure time do you have? Oh, you have more leisure time than this other person. You are probably happier than that other person, but leisure time and happiness don't necessarily always correlate. How many friends do you have? How often do you and your friends go out to dinner? How often do you engage in face-to-face conversations with people? We know that how much time do you devote to your passions or your hobbies, right? We know that these things lead to happiness, but again, they're not exactly happiness. So measurement validity is, do all these things actually measure happiness, or are the measurements not that valid? A way to think about this, it's a little bit more crude example, but when people talk about there are studies that look at things like satisfaction in romantic relationships, and one of the ways in which they try to determine satisfaction in romantic relationships is how much sexual intimacy the partners have. But what we know is that sexual intimacy, or the amount of sex a person has, doesn't necessarily mean that the person is, romantically connected to another person. There's plenty of people who have lots of sex who have, not a lot of, romantic passion in their life, right? And so when someone says, well, just because a person has a lot of sex, that must mean that they're totally in love and they're very romantic and they feel these intimate emotions and connections to everybody else. And people come in and say, no, that's not true, right? Like, increased sexual behavior doesn't exactly equate to feelings of emotional satisfaction with regard to love and romance. All right. So you want to be careful with regard to measurement validity, right? Did I measure what I said I was going to measure? All right. Measurement reliability is are my measurements consistent over time? So the way you can do this is with things like pre-test and post-test. You can do a test, and then a few months later, a couple weeks later, you come back and do another test, right? And this is because people's opinions, they change over time. And we also realize people's opinions might change over the course of the day just based on stress, mood, and being tired. So you want to make sure that your measurements are consistent over time. So if I give the person the test in the morning, when they haven't been stressed out by the day, am I going to get the same results at the end of the day after the people are stressed out from a long working day? So you want to make sure that your test is valid at all points throughout the day, depending on when you give it, or all points throughout, a couple month period. So what happens sometimes is a researcher will say, hey, can you take this happiness test for me in June and then take it again in July, right? And then we can sort of measure how, generally happy you are. Can you take this test about how satisfied you are with your family life in the morning? And can you also take it at the end of the day? Because at the end of the day, your family might have got on your nerves a little bit. So you want to make sure that you're actually measuring how, content people are with their family situation, and that it's not, constantly up and down just based on the mood of the day. All right, reliability, especially reliability coefficient. What we're looking at is that it usually happens. So again, you can't 100% predict what's going to happen 100% of the time, but reliability coefficient is just what it does is it predicts the likelihood. So again, presidential polling, in August, it doesn't say like this person is going to win the presidency, but what they say is like this person has a 70% chance of winning the presidency. It means the other person has a 30% chance, right? But the predictive quality is all about sort of predicting within a reasonable percentage range that these results are going to happen. You compare your results to many rotations of the study, and can other people replicate your results? So if you go around and say, look, here are my results, and I can predict with 70% accuracy that this is going to happen, then that means that 10 other people should be able to take your study, and at least 7 of them should come back with the same results. Now, 30% of them, right, 3 of them are going to come back with different results, but 7 of them should come back with similar results if you were going to tell me that your study has a 7% accurate or 70% accuracy rating. All right, so that's reliability. Does it occur over time? Predictive quality within a reasonable range of percentage happening. So methods that you can do for reliability. All right, test and retest method, alternative procedure, and split half. Know the difference. These are going to be on the test. All right. Test retest is that you give the same methods to the same people, again, at different times, right? And you want to see if that coefficient, that percentage is stable. So the results should remain the same. All right, so if you give someone a test about how much, how content they are with their family situation, you give them a test in June, you give them a test in July, you give them a test in August, right? You should have stable results. If it's all over the place, it means that your test is too I've lost the word. It relies too much on somebody's just mood swings, and that's not a good test. If you want to get at the core of whether or not people are content, people are happy, people feel good in their romantic relationships, you should have pretty steady results outside of just people's normal hormonal mood swings that we all have. All right. So test retest method is a way to test the same people at multiple points over the course of a reasonable time, could be a couple months, and see if you get the same results. Okay, alternative procedure method. Here you change up the questions that you're asking them to see if you get similar results. All right, so you give different methods to the same group and all the results are the same. So if you ask someone a question like, do you love your grandma? It should be the same from one study to the next, even if you ask those questions in different ways. All right. If not, you have bad methods. Now, let's take this out of the realm of a family love relationship, and let's look at a love relationship between 2 romantic partners. This is what an alternative procedure method could look like. So you could have 2 different tests. You could have a test and you could have a retest. The first test could just ask a bunch of questions about physical intimacy. All right. So quantitatively, with regard to love, how often do you and your partner hug? Do you all kiss in the morning before someone goes to work? How many times a day do you kiss? How many times a day, do you hold hands when you're on the couch, when you're out in public, going to grocery shopping? How many times a week do you and your partner engage in sexual intimacy? So you have all these sort of like physical touch type of questions, right? And that's a test. And you could look at that and say, okay, based on the amount of like physical contact between these 2 people, this is how much I think they are in love, right? The alternative procedure is, okay, now let's ask a bunch of questions, the same people, right, with regard to romantic partnerships. Let's ask them a bunch of questions about sort of non-physical touch situations that happen in their life, right? How often do you call your significant other? How often do you text them? How often do you all have face-to-face conversations? How many times a week do you all have dinner together, right? How many times a week do you all go out on a date night? Right, so these are different questions that are also trying to get to how satisfied and how satisfied people are in their romantic relationships, but it's using different methods in order to get there. If at the end of both of these, I find out like, oh, these people are pretty, in love with each other. They have a pretty stable romantic relationship. It means that my methods are pretty good, right? If I get drastically different results, right, then it means that my methods are bad, right, with regard to one of the types of tests that I gave, whether the physical intimacy test or the non-physical intimacy test. All right, so I got to figure out, what different types of questions can I ask to make sure that my results should be similar. All right, split half reliability. All right, what I do is, let's say I have a list of questions that are 100 questions long. What I want to do is I want to take those test questions, I want to split them in half, so 50 over here and 50 over here, and I should get the same results for each of these 50 questions. The reason you do this is because sometimes when people are taking a survey, let's say it's 100 questions long, In the second half, people get fatigued, right? So you all do this with like instruction evaluation at the end of the semester. It's like, sure, like 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, right? It's like I'm not gonna give the guy a 7 because that seems a little too obvious, right? They're not like a 3, right? But it's just like, okay, fine, 6s are fine, so a bunch of 5s, right? Because you just get tired. You just kind of keep filling out the same bubble all the way down. So to make sure that people haven't engaged in some sort of research fatigue, after they take the test, you split the test in half. You test one set of numbers, you test the other set of numbers, and they should get the same result. If they're not getting the same results, it means that the test is too long, people have engaged in fatigue, you need to shorten up your test, or you need to find a different way for people to take this test in order to get accurate results. All right. So you could also do, after a person takes a 100 question survey, you take all of the even numbers and you test those. You take all the odd numbers on that survey and you test those. So now you're not worried about sort of the second half fatigue fitting in, because half of the questions are going to be from the second half of the fatigue, right? Because you're going to have evens over here, you're going to have odds over here. So split half reliability. After people have taken the test, you split the test in half and add up the results separately, and you should get similar results with regard to, let's say you're studying happiness, right? How happy are you as a general, how happy are you as a person? They should be, just as happy in the first half of the test as they are in the second half of the test if you're talking about overall happiness. Okay, predictive validity, all right? I do have a YouTube clip down below that better explains this with regard to the NBA. I think this is extremely important. This is a conversation that's been going on, especially in the last 6-7 months with COVID, because a lot of schools are getting rid of things like the SAT. The GRE is something you take for graduate programs, the LSAT if you go to law school, the MCATs if you go to get a medical degree, right? So there are all these like entrance exams for colleges. And this is a good way to think about, the predictive validity of the test. So these are tests, right? SATs, ACTs, these are tests in order to get into college. And what these tests are doing, it's not whether or not you're smart enough to get into college. Colleges want to know that you are capable in order to finish school. Like based on your SAT score, can we predict whether or not you're going to have the fortitude to graduate from our university within like 4 to 6 years, depending on the degree that you're getting. That's what schools are looking at. All right, that's what the use of SATs and ACT scores are. It's not whether or not you can kind of get through your freshman seminar. It's whether or not you're going to have the juice behind you in order to sort of get through freshman seminar with a solid enough standing in order to make it a sophomore, junior, senior year graduation. So SATs, that college entrance exams, are exams that should have a predictive quality with regard to how are you going to perform in college. Now, this is where people get super upset with me and other people, right? The SATs, let's just stick with the SATs. They do predict whether or not you are going to do well in college based on the college you go to, right? They have those. I have an entire video here that explains how this works, all right? So the question is do college entrance exams predict college success? Yes, they do in most cases, right? Do not base your opinion on, well, I'm the exception. Don't be the person who's like, well, I am a really bad test taker, and like I know a friend who did terrible on the SAT and they went to college and did great. Good, one person who did it one time. Okay? What college entrance exams do is they set a bare minimum requirement that says you must have at least these basic skills in order to get into school, and that's your starting point that we can build upon as a university, we can build upon in order to get you to graduation. So if you have a super low SAT score, you should not start off in the freshman class at Harvard. All right. Now, this does not mean that you cannot end up going to medical school at Harvard, right? What it means is that there is a certain starting point that you should start at in order to predict how you need to follow along a college path in order to have the most success possible. What people are upset about with the SAT scores, they say, well, my SAT score was really low. Why can't I start off at Harvard? It's because Harvard is starting off with a class that is hundreds of points above where you started. So Harvard is teaching to the students who currently have that those sets of academic skills, right? It does not mean that you are dumb, all right? It does not mean that you are an unintelligent person. What it means is that you are starting here, right? Maybe not you, but other people starting here, and someone else is starting here. It doesn't mean that both of you can't end up here. It just means that you need to start at a certain place in order to layer upon the required skills in order to get here. Someone else might have a head start. They might have gone to a better public school system, right? K through 12, right? That happens. The SATs figure out how intelligent are you right now, like what are your baseline academic abilities right now. That's where we need to start you in higher education in order for you to solidly build upon one skill and the next in order to get to wherever you want to go. Now, what ends up happening sometimes, people want to get rid of the SATs and they say, my SAT score is garbage, but I want to go to Harvard anyways. They go to Harvard and guess what? Freshman year, they can't keep up with the material and they end up dropping out, right? Now, that doesn't mean that they're stupid. What it means is that somebody lied to them and said, you're able to go to Harvard when really you should have started off at Delaware Community College, which is fine, right? Because you needed to first obtain the skills in order to, and it might take you 2 years in order to obtain the skills at Delaware Community College in order to enter into a Harvard freshman class as far as the material that they're covering, right? You can't say, I'm bad at arithmetic, but put me into Algebra 2 calculus. No, like, be bad at arithmetic, take an arithmetic class, take a little basic geometry, take Algebra 1, take Algebra 2. Okay, now you're ready for an advanced level math course that some people are ready for right now, right out of high school, right? You might not be. So SAT scores, ACT scores, college entrance exams, they are predictive with regard to whether or not you have the current abilities in order to graduate from the college that you're going to, right? And when we mismatch people, when we put people in the wrong colleges, what ends up happening is those individuals, they end up dropping out because they can't keep up with the current material, not because they're stupid, right? But because we've put them in a situation that they're not ready for yet, right? That's the key. They're not ready for it yet. They could be ready if they just took 2 years at a community college, right? Hone their skills, and now they can go on, right? But that's what the SATs, ACTs, GREs, LSATs, that's what they're looking for, all right? I have an entire lecture on here that explains this with regard to the situation in the NBA. The long story short is you could also say, that a person's height does not determine whether or not the person is going to be an NBA point scorer champion, right? Scoring the most points in the NBA season. That's ridiculous, right? And the reason is because someone like James Harden, I think James Harden's only 6'4", right? And he's like the leading NBA scorer, right? And you're like, oh, he's pretty short compared to all the other NBA guys. Yeah, I'm 5'9". I'm not going to be the NBA top scorer, right? So there is a predictive quality that says you should be at least this tall to play in the NBA. Once you're in the NBA, we don't really know who's going to be the leading point scorer, right? But you had to be at least this tall. Same is true with the SATs. The SATs say you need to be at least this competent currently in order to graduate, right? Once you reach this bare threshold, we don't know if like the top SAT scores or the lower SAT scores are going to graduate, but SATs does say you need to at least be this in order to get into school, all right? People below that aren't going to do well at that particular school. There's other schools they can go to, right? It doesn't mean you can never go to college, right? What it means is that we just need to figure out where do we need to start you. And starting in a math class at Delaware County is different than starting in a math class at Brandywine. Is different than starting in a math class at the Penn State Business College. Is different than starting in a math class at Harvard, right? We just want to make sure that you are starting where your current skills are. Okay, there's always exceptions. Don't get caught up in the exceptions. Watch this YouTube video on the NBA stuff, and it'll explain it a lot better. All right. There's always exceptions. Don't be that person who goes around and says, I'm the exception. Yeah, there's always exceptions, right? You can't base your life on the exceptions. Okay. Conceptual fit just means that every time a test is taken, we tweak it a little bit to make sure that it's constantly fitting to the questions that we're asking. So every time a new class takes the SAT, for instance, what we do is the SAT people, they're basically tracking all those individuals and see who's graduating. And then they say, oh, people with this score on the SAT graduated. These people with this score didn't graduate. Let's tweak the test a little bit to make sure that the test is fitted to what colleges are actually teaching and what colleges are requiring in order to graduate. if the SAT was a bad way of predicting whether or not a student's going to graduate college, guess what? Schools wouldn't require it. Schools would take it and throw it in the garbage because it's very expensive for schools to kind of work through all this paperwork with regard to SATs. Schools continue to use the SATs because it actually works with regard to its predictive quality for you need at least a bare minimum score in order to successfully navigate college towards graduation. All right. And again, every time they redo the test, and they're constantly redoing the SAT test, what they're doing is they're trying to tweak it based on, you know, we were a little bit wrong in these areas, we're a little bit more right in these areas. We need to kind of tweak the test a little bit to make sure that it's more and more predicting with validity who's going to graduate and who's not going to graduate. Okay, there's a couple procedures you can do to check the validity. A manipulation check is you can manipulate the environment the person's in. This is different than the controlling environmental influences. There's a slight difference, but there's a difference enough. So, for instance, they give an example in the textbook where they want to ask students whether or not their professors are competent, and they do it in two different ways, right? So they manipulate the offices, right? So they go and they have a student go to a professor, and they put that student in a messy office space, and they say, this is your professor's office. Talk to your professor for a while. Come back out and tell me whether or not the professor is competent. They don't tell them that they screwed up the office. They say, go talk to the professor. They walk in and they see all this mess everywhere, right? And they also have a student walk and talk to a professor with regard to a neat office space. And again, they don't tell them that they've manipulated the office, but they have the same conversation with the same professor. Students walk out, and students have very different views on whether or not a professor is competent just based on the messy space around them. So if we can mess up the environment, then we can tell, you know, is a student accurately reporting whether or not their professor is competent based on what the professor is saying, what the knowledge the professor has, or is there this third variable that we don't know about with regard to messy office spaces, for instance, that is influencing students' opinions of their professor? There's some really interesting research and conversations going on with regard to professional dress in academia. So whether or not professors should be sort of like dressing like business casual, whether or not we should go back to this sort of like suit and tie atmosphere on college campuses, and what does that do to the overall atmosphere of the institution with regard to students' opinions of the professors and how students engage in their academic studies when it comes to seeing a professor who's more dressed down versus seeing a professor who's more buttoned up, right? These little manipulations do influence the atmosphere on a college campus. If you walk on a campus and every professor is like suit and tie, right? Business dress. My assumption is there's probably not too many. There's probably some, but not too many female professors wearing suit and ties. But business dress, business skirt, suit and ties for the male professors. That's a very different environment to walk into. It's a little bit more intimidating, but it's a very different environment with regard to how students feel like they need to conduct themselves in the classroom in order to get the grades they want to get. You walk onto a college campus and there's a lot of professors wearing, khaki pants and, a polo. It's a little bit more dressed down. I had some professors back in my day who wore like jeans and a t-shirt with like, Birkenstock sandals. And you're like, this is just a very different atmosphere, and it makes you feel different in the classroom when you're a student. So you can manipulate the area around the student in order, or around the participant, to see if they're responding differently. You can control for environmental influences. Now this is a little bit different because now what we're talking about is putting people in a lab setting versus putting people into a natural setting. So different settings can influence people. So if you're conducting a study on reading habits, for instance, and you go around and you ask people at a library, they're probably going to report their reading habits differently than if they're at the mall. It could be the same people, right? But when a person's in a library, they probably feel a little bit more studious. And they're like, oh yeah, I read a little. They probably overestimate how much they read, right? If you go to a mall, people probably underestimate how much they read just based on the environment, all right? If you're at Thanksgiving dinner, right, and someone's asking you about how much you care and love about your family, you're probably going to over-report, right? Oh, I care about my family a lot. The holidays are important. And then come like March, like we're in right now, it's like, I haven't seen my family since Thanksgiving. And so like, who really knows how much I love and care about them, all right? So you want to make sure that you're asking people the same question in different environments to see if the environment is changing their response. And finally, there's something known as the sleeper effect, which means that some results are not immediate. So really, well, it means it's like people need time to think. So this is what's a little bit, this is what makes political polling. This is one of the faults in political polling is if someone just calls me up on the phone, I'm in the middle of the work and they're like, who are you going to vote for? I'm like, I don't know. I'm not even thinking about the thing right now. I'm working on this thing for work. And so people are, they just say a name or they say, I don't know, and they hang up. People just need a little bit of time to think on some questions. And so you can't just kind of go through a survey really quick because there is what's known as a sleeper effect. All right, the Hawthorne effect is people change their behavior if they know they're being studied. So you have a laboratory setting, right? This becomes increasingly important to account for the Hawthorne effect when things are controversial. So let's look at this Nielsen people meter thing situation for a second, right? This relates to the Hawthorne effect in this way, right? So Nielsen, the Nielsen family company, they're the ones who study how people watch TV. Everyone, you might have gotten something in the mail at some point in your life. Everybody usually does, and ask you about your TV habits. What it used to do is it used to study how people watch TV in a laboratory, right? So you think way back in the day, they would take a family of 4 and they would be like, come to this laboratory house that we've created and just watch TV with your family for a couple hours. It's a little bit weird, right? People knew that they were being studied and they knew they were there to be studied on their TV watching habits. So they're going to watch TV differently, right? So, you have these researchers looking at them like, how often do they change the channel? How much do they screw around with the volume? Do they argue about what to watch on TV? This kind of thing, right? The research question for this Hawthorne effect with people meters is, how closely are people actually paying attention to TV? If I watch TV at home, I probably watch TV. I might, go use the bathroom. I might go make myself a sandwich in the kitchen. The TV might be on. I might be having a conversation over here with a friend. I might answer the phone, right? So I'm going to watch TV very differently than if I go to a laboratory setting and they say, you are here to watch TV. Then I'm probably just watching TV for 2 hours straight and not worried about all these other distractions. When you're in your house, you're watching TV very differently than you would in a laboratory setting, right? So laboratory settings change your behavior, okay? But they help control variables, so there's this pro and con situation here. All right, let's go back to here, right? The Hawthorne effect becomes important knowing that it exists when the topic is controversial. So let's say a researcher sits you down and asks you questions with regard to like, are you racially biased? You're like, oh, right? Do you think women can be good leaders? Right? This becomes difficult because people want to give responses that they think are, they want to give good responses, right? They don't want to give a response and be like, yeah, you know what, I have some prejudice, right? I don't know if women are going to be, like, I used to have a woman who was a boss and she wasn't a good leader. Like, nobody's going to answer like that, right, to a researcher. So the Hawthorne effect is, this predictive quality, or not a predictive quality, but it wants to take into account that some people change their behavior when they know that they're being studied. People want to give responses that they think are socially acceptable. And it could be, it's called social desirability. It could be, I want the researcher to think that I'm a good person, right? It could also mean that I might not be doing it intentional. I might be given a response unconsciously because I want to feel like a good person too. Like, I don't want to, if I have, let's say that I have a bias against women who are leaders, I don't want to say that out loud to myself. All right. So I might give a response because I want to affirm that, oh, Josh, you're not sexist when it comes to women in positions of leadership, right? So it's me telling myself a story with regard to, being studied, all right? So that's what the Hawthorne effect is that sometimes people change their behavior if they know they're being studied. When it comes to the researcher, himself or herself, the researcher can influence the participant's response. So there's what's known as personal attribute effect. So participants react to a researcher's personal attributes, such as sex, race, gender, personality, etc., right? So imagine this, right? Imagine that somebody is asking me a question, or is it giving me a survey, and the survey is all about race relations in the United States. If someone sits me down to give me that survey, might I be influenced by the researcher's race? Possibly. Could I be giving different answers to different people of different racial backgrounds when it comes to the researchers who's asking these questions? Absolutely, I could be, right? Same thing is true with sex, right? So if somebody's asking me about, sexism, right, or somebody's asking me about, relationships between men and women in romantic relationships, might I be answering those questions differently if a man is asking me those questions versus if a woman is asking me those questions, right? And the truth of the matter is, yes, like that's a possibility, right? I don't know if it's going to happen or not. Like I haven't been asked these questions, but to act, but to act as if I wouldn't somehow like if this is not a possibility, even if it's unconscious, right? So again, this isn't like blatant outward discrimination or biases, but there should be a recognition that the researcher's personal attributes could affect the participant's answers. So sometimes what people do, right, is they use different researchers. So let's say that I'm, doing a study on race. Instead of me just doing a study on race, I might put together a team of like 5 people from various racial backgrounds, and we could all sort of collaborate on the study of race, just so that we're trying to eliminate racial prejudice or racial biases with regard to the participants with whom we're asking questions, right? And the same thing is true with regard to, romantic relationship research. Like I might want to put together a research team of a few women, a few men, people who are of different sexual orientations, right? Put that research team together to sort of go out and elicit responses, so I can try to mute any biases that would sneak through if it was just me going out there asking people about their romantic relationships. All right. Pros and cons. You can use different researchers, but then you might get different results. You can use the same research, but some participants might be biased toward that researcher, right? So there are pros and cons to putting together sort of like multiple researchers to ask similar types of questions, especially when it comes to controversial research. All right, there's something known as the Rosenthal. It's more commonly known as the Pygmalion Effect, so we'll go with Pygmalion Effect. The Pygmalion Effect comes from this, right? Greek mythology. So here's this guy down here. All right, this is Pygmalion, and the Greek mythology behind this is he's a sculptor, and he creates a sculpture, and then like that sculpture becomes his lover, right? So he's sort of creating what it is that he wants. All right. So the Pygmalion effect is that participants react in a way that they think the researchers want them to react. So you have to be careful of this, right? So if a researcher unintentionally smiles during a quote unquote right answer that confirms the hypothesis, the participant might continue to go down the road of giving those types of answers, or those types of conclusions to the researcher's questions. All right. So you have to be careful as a researcher to be very neutral, right? Or to remove yourself entirely, just give out a test and then you leave the room, right? But if you are doing any sort of interaction, you want to make sure that you're not unintentionally smiling or being too excited or being too unexcited about certain answers, because you don't want to influence the ways in which people are going to continue to answer those types of questions. All right, finally, this is important. I got to spend a little bit of time here. All right, this is super important. Take notes. This will definitely be on the exam. When you are getting samples, you want to make sure that those samples are random samples. And a random sample means everyone should have an equal chance of being picked. Now, within your population, all right? So when it comes to conducting research, you want to say, what's my population? Is my population 18 to 24-year-old college students? That's a certain population. There are X millions amount of people in that population. Everybody within that population should have an equal chance of being picked for your study. Now, you could say, I want a random sample, but I'm only going to study students on Brandywine's campus. If you're only going to study students on Brandywine's campus, that entire population is about 1,500 people, right? And let's say you need to pick 200 of them. All 1,500 people on Brandywine's campus should have an equal chance of being a part of your study. So the sample is random. So you figure out what's the most amount of people involved in my population? What is the total number of people involved in my population? all of those people within that population that you're studying should have an equal chance of getting picked. And if they don't have an equal chance of getting picked, then it's not a random sample, right? Or you need to sort of limit the scope. So you could say, I want to do a survey on college students. Well, let's say that there are 20 million people. I don't know how many college students are in the United States, right? Okay, well, we'll do that too. U.S. college students or college students on American campuses. There we go. Let's say there's 20 million. If all 20 million of those individuals don't have an equal shot of being picked for your survey, you can't say that that's the population you're studying. Instead, you might want to limit the scope and just say, I don't have the ability to random sample 20 million people. I do have the ability to maybe random sample all college students who are currently taking college classes in the state of Pennsylvania, right? And so that's a smaller population, but that's the sample, or that's the population that I can now generalize my results to once my survey is over, once my study is over. All right, so this becomes a problem. All right, again, when we talk about things like smoking habits, right? People say I did research and it shows that smoking habits are going down, and I say, well, what's your population, right? So if someone says, smoking habits across America are going down, and I say, well, who did you survey for this? And they say, well, I'm a researcher on a college campus, so I pulled from 18 to 24-year-old college students. And I say, well, then your research does not say anything about smoking habits across the United States going down. It says a lot. It says something about smoking habits among college students 18 to 24 going down, because those are the people you pulled from. That's your population, and then you randomly sample within the population. All right, so you want to make sure that the population you are studying, you want to make sure you know the perimeters of the population you're studying, and then pick from that population. And then when you share your results, you don't exaggerate, right? You tell people, look, the population that I studied was only US college students, and I randomly sampled them in this way, and these people are actually representative of my entire population. All right, okay, so let's say that you want to do a sample. Let's say you want to study Penn State Brandywine students. Your entire population is 1,500 students. Now you say, okay, how many people within this 1,500 students do I need to sample in order to get the results? And the answer might be, I have to interview 200 of them. Now, all 1,500 students need to have an equal shot of being involved in your survey. So there are ways in which you can find those 200 people you need to survey, because you don't know who you have to survey. You just know that they have to be out of the Penn State Brandywine student population. But you don't get to pick them individually. You have to randomly pick them. And this is how you can randomly pick 200 students on Brandywine's campus. The first is a simple random sample. And what this means is that you take 1,500 students on Brandywine's campus. If you go to the administration, maybe they have a list, student number 1 starting the A's, student number 1,500, last name starts with the letter Z, right? You have 1,500 students, and you just randomly pick, metaphorically speaking, you take 1,500 little pieces of paper, you throw them in a hat, you pick out 200, and you say, okay, student 167, find out who that is on the list. Student 589, find out who that is on the list, right? You randomly pick them out of a hat, right? There are computer programs that do this, that do research things where you say, here are all 1,500 people in my population. Computer, randomly pick 200 of them. And the computer shoots out 200 names, and it's just random. All right. You could do something like the city of New York, right? New York City politics. This is how political polling is supposed to work. Pollsters, they go into the voting rolls, the people who are registered to vote, and they say, here are all the people who are over the age of 18, right? Because they have to be over the age of 18, because not all U.S. citizens can vote, right? Some of them are minors, right? So they don't include those people in the population. It doesn't matter who that high school kid's going to vote for, right? So I'm not going to put them on my population list. So pollsters go in and they say, here are the list of all the people in the United States who are eligible to vote. You're only going to include those people. Now I'm going to randomly pick, 500 of those people. I'm going to call them up on the phone and say, who are you going to vote for, Trump or Biden? right? And then you hang up, right? It would not make any sense to ask a 14-year-old who they want for president because that 14-year-old can't vote. All right, they're not included in the population. All right, so everybody in your population, you randomly pick out however many people you need to pick out. All right. Systemic or ordinal sampling. What this means is that you pick every nth person, and nth person just means you pick a number, right? It could be every 9th person in the phone book. So let's say you're going through, you want to know of all the people who live in New York City, how many of them like Mayor Bill de Blasio? And you might say, I'm going to do an ordinal sample. I'm going to do a systemic ordinal sample. You open up the New York City phone book and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You call that person up. Do you like Bill de Blasio? Yes or no? Right? They give you an answer. Hang up. Then you count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You go to that person, right? You stay in order and you just keep picking every 9th person from the sheet A to Z, right? Until you get to, let's say that you need to survey 500 people. You could do the same thing, right, in Penn State Brandywine system. There's 1,500 people on Penn State Brandywine's campus, students. You need 200 people. You say, I'm going to pick every 6th person on the list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You call up that person. You know, ask them your question about Penn. So you're doing smoking habits of students on Brandywine's campus. Do you smoke? Yes or no? Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You call up that person. Do you smoke? Yes or no? Now, here's the thing. If someone does not participate, you do not go to the next person on the list. You have to count 6 more again. All right? So you stay in order the whole time. So let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Call up the Brandywine student. Do you smoke? And they say, no, I don't smoke. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You call up that person. That person says, I don't want to participate in your stupid survey. You hang up. You count 6 more. And you keep going. Maybe you get to the end. You don't have 200. You just go back to the letter A and you keep going until you get to 200 people. All right? This is how exit polling works during presidential elections. So exit polling works in this systemic ordinal way. So what you have is you have somebody outside of the voting booth and their boss at the pollster place says, look, every 7th person that comes out of that voting booth, I want you to ask them who they voted for, right? So I sit there and I wait for 7 people to exit and I go up to the 7th person and say, excuse me, would you like to participate in this exit poll for me? And if they say yes, it's like, cool, like who'd you vote for? And then they're gonna ask demographic information, right? Because this is how we understand, like, so many white people voted for Trump, so many black people voted for Trump. The average income for people who voted for Biden is whatever. The average age of people who voted for Biden is whatever, right? When you see this stuff on the news on election night, this is how it's collected, all right? Every, let's say, 7th person comes out of the voting booth. A pollster sits there and says, tell me all your demographic information and who you voted for. And then the news is able to report it, like the amount of, of all the black people who came out of the polling booths, 9 out of 10 of them, 90% of them said they voted for Joe Biden, right? And only 1 out of every 10 of black individuals who came out of the voting booth said that they voted for President Trump. So we have a pretty good idea now. Joe Biden has about a 90% to 10% win amongst African Americans, all right? So that's how these exit polls work. Now, you could get down to that 7th person. You're sitting there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Someone comes out of the voting booth and says, excuse me, can you tell me all this information about yourself and who you voted for? And that person might say, no, screw you. Like, this is a private affair. I don't want to tell you who I voted for. I don't want to give you any demographic information. And then you have to say, cool, thank you very much. But now you have to wait for 7 more people. You can't just go to the next person. You got to wait for 7 more people to come out of that voting booth. All right? This is how exit polling information is gathered. All right. Okay, know the difference between simple and systemic. Next, convenient sample is just who is here, right? So if you want to know people's shopping habits, you might just go to the mall and ask people like who are currently already at the mall. Obviously during COVID, that's not going to work as well, right? But yeah, you might need to go to where people are in order to get, information. Obviously, this is going to like leave out people who shop online, right? People who don't go to the mall, they're not going to be included in your survey. So you have to limit the population to people who still shop at the mall, shop at these stores. You can't say like people in general shop at these stores because some people are ordering stuff online. What you could say is the population of people who shop at the mall, these are the stores that you're usually going to, right? And then finally, you have a volunteer sample, right? So A volunteer sample doesn't mean that you just say like, hey, everybody, whoever wants to come and talk about these certain issues can come talk about these certain issues, because you're going to have bias. So let's say, for example, that you are going to do research on the racial climate on college campuses. You might end up, what you're going to do is you're going to get a lot of people who come to your survey who are passionate about this issue, who care about this issue, right? Who are affected by this issue. So you're going to oversample people who are already tuned into the racial climate on college campus, and you're not going to get a good idea of the racial climate in general, because there's going to be a lot of people on campus who are very indifferent, right? They're going to be like, I'm not going to go to this thing because they don't think that racial climate is a big deal on campus, all right? So you have to make sure that when you're doing some sort of volunteer sample, what usually happens is you get 5,000, let's say you get 5,000 people to respond, and then after you get the sample, you then do a random or a systemic ordinal sample in order just to get 500 of them to participate. So you might say, look, like I need 500 participants. I want them to be volunteer because I don't want to be calling people up on the phone. So let me just get 5,000 people like into this metaphorical room and say like, would you like to participate in this? And then once I get all these people to respond, then I'm only going to choose 500 of them, because I can be a little bit more random with the 500 that I choose as opposed to all 5,000 that respond, because when the 5,000 who respond, it's probably oversampling people who are specifically interested in that topic. I might be able to weed some people out if after I get 5,000 to respond, then I do a random sample of just 500 participants. All right. So I need a big enough pool to draw from in order to make it random. All right. Okay. But these two, know what they are, convenience and volunteer, but know what they are, but you don't need them too much. The big things is if you need to go back and review these, go back and review these for simple random sample and systemic ordinal sample. Make sure you understand them. If you don't, we'll talk about them in class. Whew, all right, that was a lot. I know it's a lot, but it's definitely important information you need to know. And I will talk to you all next time.